Hello everyone, welcome to our third webinar for Customer Centricity Month 2023, using impact mapping to prioritise the right thing. It's lovely to have so many of you signed up for today. Clearly impact mapping is a very popular topic. So before we get started, and while people are still tuning in, I just want to say hi and introduce exactly what Customer Centricity Month is. So I'm Lauren, I work in the marketing and events team at CX Partners. And at CX Partners, we work with organizations to drive growth, unlock opportunities, and enable teams to work together more effectively. We do this through our research programs, user-centered design, and by embedding a culture of customer centricity within organizations. So last year, we started Customer Centricity Month as a way of creating dedicated content that's all about the value of user-centered design and putting customers at the heart of your organization. This year, we're running the series again, but we're focusing on how customer centricity can make organizations more resilient and enable them to thrive when external conditions can make it challenging. This focus came from some research we conducted this year into how turbulent environments may affect organizations and their ability to remain customer centric. We've recently published a white paper with our findings from this study, so I'll send a link to where you can download it from at the end of the session. So as I mentioned earlier, this is the third webinar of the month. So far, we've had sessions on staying competitive in challenging times and building customer-centric teams, and we'll be running another 2 webinars, both at 11 a.m. every Wednesday throughout November. So if you haven't already, make sure they're in your diary, and I'll pop a link in the chat in a moment. But now I'm going to hand over to today's speakers. So leading today's session, we have Nicola Pritchard, who's our Principal Service Designer. Nicola has 12 years of experience in a range of roles, and she brings experience in systems thinking and qualitative research practices that centre on achieving positive and social environmental impact. Directly before joining CX Partners, Nicola worked within a social impact consultancy supporting purpose-driven organisations to set and measure their strategies for impact. We're also joined by our brilliant guest speaker, Naomi Shearon, who is the strategy lead at Sport England. Naomi is the architect of Sport England's 10-year strategy to transform lives and communities through sport and physical activity. At the heart of this strategy is a vision of a nation that's alive with physical activity, where people are connected to each other and the places they live through sport and movement. So there'll be time at the end for questions, but please do add them to the Q&A or the chat throughout the webinar, and we'll run through as many as possible at the end. Nicola, I'll hand over to you now.
Brilliant. Thank you, Lauren. Hope everyone can see the changing slides. Let me know if it's not moving on. Thanks so much, Lauren, for the intros and for giving us the platform to talk to you all today. Impact mapping is a topic I'm super passionate about, and my stealth goal for this session is to leave you all with some excitement and inspiration for how to bring this methodology into your own context. I'm going to go into why we're here talking about impact mapping in a minute. But firstly, I wanted to bring in our wonderful guest speaker, Naomi. Naomi, I've had the pleasure of working with you and supporting your impact mapping journey within Sport England. So thank you so much for joining us.
Hello, it's an absolute pleasure to be here. Yeah, I'm Naomi. This is what I used to look like a few years ago. And yeah, I'm strategy lead at Sport England, and before that I was a consultant and I specialised in change strategies. So I suppose in plain English, how do you help individuals, communities, organisations to make change happen? So yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure to work with you as well, Nicola. Thank you so much for inviting me today.
Thanks, Naomi. And is it fair to say we were kind of pleasantly surprised by the number of people that signed up to this?
Yeah, yes, we thought there was a chance that we'd be by ourselves, kind of geeking out about this. So it's really exciting to have a bit of a community here. But yeah, it makes sense, doesn't it? Because actually, I think more and more organisations and services are thinking about that long-term impact and the impact that they have on society as a whole. So it's really nice to be joined by some people.
Yes, thank you for joining us and making sure that we're not alone in this chat. And yeah, and I think when we met up and talked about why we're excited about impact mapping, Naomi, you mentioned the concept of a scaffold, which I really liked, because I think when it comes to navigating the amount of uncertainty of today and the challenges that we're facing as a society and in our environment, we really need simple ways of helping us to pave the way and provide support and grounding and to keep us on the straight and narrow. So for me, that conjured up the image of a scaffold of a roller coaster that prevents us from veering off the tracks and lead us towards some sort of desired destination. Though, unlike a roller coaster, hopefully it won't be sending us back to where we started. So moving on. So in terms of what we're hoping to cover a bit today, we'll be looking a little bit at what we think impact means to us, what it involves, what does impact mapping involve, what does it look like in practice, and we're going to be drawing a lot on Naomi's experience within Sport England. Where might we start with prioritisation and in doing this method in general, but also what challenges and questions are we holding, and we're really keen to start that dialogue with you. So do use the chat, and as we're going on, please do pop any thoughts, considerations, questions in there as we go. So when we looked again at the title of this webinar, we recognised that there are some quite loaded and subjective concepts in there. And when we talk about impact and the right thing, these have very different meanings to us. And those meanings are also constantly in flux based on our particular motivations and priorities in any given moment in time, but also the context that we're working in. So we are going to try and hold the space for some of those tensions today and those differences, but also look to narrow our focus a little bit just to help guide the conversation. And so just before we begin, we'd love you to have a bit of a think about what the word impact conjures up for you right now. What does it look and feel like? What does it mean to you? And it might be that your mind goes directly to your personal impact, or it might take you to your team and the work that you're doing as a team at the moment, or it might take you to your wider organisation and what your collective impact is looking like. So if you do feel like it, do pop any thoughts that come up, any spontaneous ideas, just pop them in the chat and begin that conversation. I think what's interesting is even I opened a physical English dictionary this week for the first time in years. And I kind of stumbled on this, which made me laugh, that even the dictionary is describing impact as having the unenviable status of jargon, which makes it doubly disliked. I think it's also disliked because it's used grammatically in very incorrect ways. But anyway, that's by the by. So I think that gives us even more reason for why actually narrowing down can help us, because we don't want to operate in that jargon space, and because it is so ubiquitous, we need to ground it somewhere. And so for the purposes of today's conversation, when we're talking about impact, really what we're really getting at is that lasting effect of our products, of our services, of our organizations, on our users, on the wider society, and on the planet. And so you can think of it a little bit like the legacy that we're leaving, or the imprint, or the marked change. The word impact, actually, the root of that is Latin, which means driven in. So that's that idea of what imprint are you leaving, what mark are you leaving, and what's sustained after our work ends. So what do we mean when we're talking about impact mapping? So impact mapping as a methodology comes in lots of different guises, and different techniques can come under this same umbrella. Gokyo Adzik has done a lot of work on impact mapping within the agile software development space. I've got his book somewhere, which is brilliant. But other techniques as well, such as the opportunity tree and 3 Horizons framework, all have similarities too. And so we're not really wedded to any one methodology. I think what's really important is what it's giving us. But what we'll be drawing on today in terms of techniques is called theory of change, which a lot of you will be familiar with. And that's been used for a very long time within the nonprofit space for several decades, specifically supporting evaluators with the measurement of social impact of longer term programs of work. But we feel like there's so much scope and opportunity to be using this technique in so many different purpose-driven spaces, and I've personally found it extremely useful in lots of different contexts. So in a nutshell, our approach to impact mapping is really a way of connecting what we're doing, the products and services that we're putting out into the world, with what we're wanting to achieve for people and the planet. So another way of describing it would be impact mapping for good. And I think Lauren's going to pop some questions in the chat to get you thinking about, well, how often are you actually thinking about impact in your team or your organizations? And what tools are you using that are helping you connect what you're doing with what you want to achieve? And I think what's really exciting is that, you know, given the number of people that have signed up today, there's such a need for these kinds of methodologies, and they can take so many different forms. So we're hoping really to learn from each other and to build that community as much as we can. I'm going to hand over to Naomi in a minute because I'm talking a lot, but wanted to firstly just give a brief example of what an impact map might look like at a very high level. So let's take Oatly, for example. If we were to connect Oatly's activity, which is providing sustainable alternatives to dairy product, with what its end goal is, it might look a little bit like this. But we've definitely taken some liberties with Oatly's sustainability report. So this is not gospel, it's not brand approved, and terms and conditions do apply. So please take this lightly. So they provide sustainable alternatives to dairy products. And in doing so, they're making it easier for people to make sustainable food choices. And as a result of those healthier, more sustainable food choices, there might be a reduction in consumption of other dairy market products. And as a result of that trend, the wider food system might begin to be influenced towards more plant-based production. And over time, we might begin to see a reduction in the carbon footprint within the dairy food system, and also potentially also improved health outcomes amongst consumers. And so by mapping out that chain of outcomes and establishing some overall impact goals, Oatly can hold themselves accountable to their end goal. Are their dairy alternatives having a direct or indirect impact on health outcomes, for example, and on carbon emissions? If so, why? And if not, what can they do about it? So that's just one example, but I want to kind of bring a much more live example into the room, which is obviously the work that you've been doing, Naomi, at Sport England. So what does all of this mean in the context of Sport England?
Actually, before I talk about the work we're doing, I'm just going to give a couple of sentences on Sport England. I don't expect anyone or everyone to know who we are. So Sport England is an arm's length body of government. It was established by Royal Charter in the 70s. And essentially, we're responsible for growing and developing grassroots, community level sport, physical activity and movement across England. So how people move for fun. So we're publicly funded. At the moment, that's around 25% exchequer and 75% lottery good causes. So hopefully that gives you a sense of the sort of organisation we are in the context that we're doing this work in. In 2021, we launched our latest strategy, Uniting the Movement, and that has led us to a process of really trying to deeply understand the impact that we do make and the impact that we could make. So this is why I'm here. It's probably a good time to say I don't think of myself as an expert, but I've had some recent experience, and perhaps it's helpful for me to pepper this presentation with the way this has gone and the way it's felt for us. But this is such an interesting and important topic for me because, as you can see, our work is based on a core belief. We've carried that with us from the start. It might change, but that feels like one of the most, I suppose, unmoving factors, features of our organisation, that when we move, we're stronger as individuals, communities and society. What we practically do is basically invest public money and our time and energy and expertise as a group of around 300 people to make sport physical activity accessible to everyone. And as you can see here, the lasting effect that we're hoping to leave is a very big societal vision. It's a nation that's alive with physical activity, where people are connected to each other, the places that they live through sport and movement, and essentially a country where people can thrive and feel healthier in their mind and body. So we have got a gap between the work that we do and the vision that we hold. And we've been on a journey of impact mapping to plot out what the steps are between the work that we do and the realisation of that vision. So in practice, that's been breaking it down into the important changes that we expect to see and reaching a shared notion of kind of how this thing is meant to go. How do we believe that this is meant to happen? How do we think this is going to play out? So yes, Nicola, as you go through, obviously I'll just kind of chip in with my experiences of that process.
Amazing, thanks, Naomi. And so we're going to talk a bit first about what impact mapping involves at a high level. So let's see if that moves. Ooh. There we go. So typically impact mapping is a backwards mapping process where you start by defining what you want that long-term impact to be. What is that North Star? And then you move backwards through the journey, looking at longer term outcomes that you think will lead to that, then your medium term outcomes, short term, and finally what solutions or actions you will take to nudge that domino effect along the path that you're hoping for. So outcomes can be described as the sustained changes that are happening along that journey, or as Naomi said, those sort of steps that are going to signal whether you're moving towards that longer term vision. And it can be really helpful to draw on the COMBI model of behavior change to think about changes in your audiences in terms of motivation, in terms of opportunities, capabilities, and their behaviors. It's important to note that this is very much a theory. So this is your map of how you think things are going to play out. But of course, that means holding on to it lightly, because we never know how change is going to happen. We don't know how the contexts are going to shift and how things are really going to play out. So this is your best guess at how things might go based on your hypotheses. And you can root that in evidence to support your hypotheses for where you think things will change. And then you can, as an organization or as a team, you can treat each step within your map like a milestone to work out whether things are going according to plan or whether you're likely to need to course correct. So just to give a really silly example, I was thinking about a kind of an individual level goal that I have, and this is a really live goal because I really do need to improve my memory. I have a terrible memory, and so I was thinking about, well, what is the first thing I could do to kickstart an improvement in my memory? And so I was thinking about, well, if I go to bed early, then that's likely that it'll mean that I consume less caffeine in the morning. I have less of a need for caffeine and added sugars to wake me up in the morning. And if I'm not reaching for caffeine and added sugars, then that's likely to help me to reach for richer and healthier food choices. And if I'm reaching for healthier food choices, and that's likely to give me more energy. And if I have more energy, then I'm much more likely to pop on my trainers and get out for a run and do some exercise. And if I'm doing more exercise, then that's also likely to lower my stress. My stress is also going to be lowered by the fact that I've got more time in the morning to do more mindfulness exercises, things that I know set me up well for the day. And exercise, we also know, is proven to improve cognitive functioning. So my theory is that all of these things accumulate towards improving my memory. One can only hope. But I think what's important to note is that this kind of technique can work at so many different levels. And I think that's what's so great about it, is that it is versatile and that you can use it within very different scales of change. I've just given a very kind of low level, individual level scale. But what we're going to do now is zoom right out and look at the ecosystem view that Naomi's been looking at. But before I hand over to Naomi, I think one of the things that's really key here is that the examples I walked through a moment ago were very simple, they're very logical, very linear, very neat and tidy. But of course, the reality is that change is never that straightforward. And it's important to have that space to diverge and to acknowledge those contradictions, the tensions, the messiness of change before being able to kind of converge and create some clarity within that. And this was actually, Naomi, you reminded me that this wasn't the messiest version. We've got another one that was much messier. But the first mapping workshop that we worked together on was where we started to brainstorm and group the outcomes for Sport England. And we did work backwards from the impact until we reached Sport England's activities, but then we worked forwards again to test the logic and kind of bring in some of the constraints that we were working within in terms of the work that Sport England does. It's very unlikely that you're ever going to have a carte blanche. And within that process, we found various reinforcing feedback loops that reflected the complex space that Sport England's operating in. So Naomi, is it fair to say that we had a lot to begin with? And can you describe what the process has been from there?
Yeah, I mean, this was, I think, output of an initial working session, it actually got much messier from here, a lot messier. So the first time this was created, from memory, by about 5 or 6 kind of well-placed people who initially came together to start this thinking, and just kind of see what happens if a few people from kind of strategy, performance, transformation, research and insight, evaluation come together. I think we started with those people because they're people who essentially typically try to hold the overarching logics for change in their minds as their job. So we thought, well, can we do something here together? And it was really fascinating process, because we realized that we had a lot of shared assumptions about how this was meant to happen, but there were some key differences. So we actually had to tease out a lot more around some belief systems and some assumptions in that first workshop than I'd have anticipated. But where that got us to was a really interesting shared picture. We felt really good about it, but we also realized that we were missing some vital perspectives from other people. So essentially, the people who work to make this happen hold really important perspectives, information, evidence to test our assumptions and our beliefs. So we actually made the choice to widen the process, and we ran maybe 20-ish working sessions with information owners, kind of project service leads, people working in and on some of these kind of areas that we were uncovering, some partners that we worked directly with, and even kind of external evaluators and consultants who could help us think. And so what that led to is, yes, an even messier version, but even more clear orientation around some key outcomes and drivers of change. So that felt like an essential step for an organisation like us, who works with and through so many people to achieve our mission. And it really enriched our map. It's worth saying it was a really powerful and engaging process in and of itself. So far from feeling dry and theoretical, the process of explaining to each other the often unwritten and unspoken assumptions we carried on our mind about how all this was meant to happen and how my bit contributes, and the meaning behind my work, was a really, really engaging, I'd say real sort of bond building process. I think we all understood each other a lot more across the organisation afterwards. And we were able to start to orientate around a much more shared vision about how we thought that this might all work. And that was really, really inspiring and energising. So we have got to a sort of emerging shared version of the truth. I'll share that in a minute. But something that I really feel I would like to share, and you probably have had these experiences yourself, so I'm really interested in the chat if you have, is whilst this is a backwards mapping process, and there's a sort of necessity in that, because if you start from now and go forward, it's kind of what is the North Star? You can lose yourself. So this kind of starting with the end in mind, if we're really trying to get here, what happens before that, what happens before that, what happens before that, when do we get to ourselves, is a sort of essential logic. And some people are really comfortable in that space. So I guess people with the capacity to think that way, who possibly have the sort of jobs where you have a wider time frame in mind, that felt comfortable and exploratory. But to others, that sort of technique was clearly starting to feel quite distant and frustrating. So I had people who felt that it was using a lot of their time, and they are in situations where they're essentially on the front line, on the coalface, working in situations that feel very precarious at the moment. Programs, services, organisations that truthfully are struggling to survive. And their sort of mindset and energy was much more just, I just need to get here. If I can just get there, literally, you know, even to the week, to the month. And it became very clear to me that they had very rich information and perspectives, and we needed to welcome that perspective, that information, that energy into this process. So the image here is of a desert, and there's a kind of, a colleague was talking to me recently about this survival theory that if you found yourself dropped into a desert and you knew you had to get to a city to survive, on the nearest populated area, your survival mindset is what has to happen next. If I can just get to this ridge, I can see where I am. And so this kind of plotting forward and plotting backwards became a really important interplay and dynamic with richness from both perspectives. It also helped us to guard against what you might call the rigidity, which I think theory of change has kind of been criticised for, which is, you get this quite rigid view of how things are meant to happen. And in reality, we hit the real world, don't we? And we have to be adaptive, and we have to continuously upgrade and change our new evidence appears. We're upgrading our thinking all the time. We're adapting to the context. So holding those two things together for me feels essential in this process. I don't think it's an either or personally. So where we got to, this is a highly simplified version, but it gives you a sense about what's emerging for Sport England. So as Nicola said, this has been all about connecting what we are doing practically to what we're trying to achieve. So starting with the end, about what we're trying to achieve, the impact that we're looking for is improved social outcomes as a result of physical activity. So a really interesting part of this for us has been, how do we know? And we've got some indicators that mean something to us now around social return on investment, proving the links between physical activity and improved lives on multiple factors. And also reduced inequalities in sport and physical activity. And again, we've needed to get to a level of specificity. What inequalities? What does reduction look like? How will we know? And then we've rowed back to the long-term outcomes of, well, what leads to that? What is more active? Again, we've said, well, for us, it's being active, more people being active to the level that you benefit from. And the strongest evidence is one that Chief Medical Officer holds, where they've set an activity level for anyone 150 minutes a week, where you really benefit health-wise, mental health, strength, physical health from your activity levels. And they've also identified a level of inactivity, which is harmful to us, which actually, if you're interested, is 30 minutes a week. So less than 30 minutes a week of activity is harmful to our bodies. So we've said both of those matter to us. So in plain English, increasing benefit, reducing harm. So those are our long-term outcomes. And then we rode back and said, well, what is it that enables ultimately millions of people to every day, every week, every month make a choice to be more active? It's the behaviour change challenge. And we mined our evidence, our evaluations, academic work, the work of our partners, and we identified these things as the major drivers: individual relationship with activity, whether it feels relevant to me, whether it links to my essential life motivations, whether I think that I can do it, whether I see versions of it that inspire me and engage me, whether it fits into my social norms. Inclusive experiences being provided by multiple organisations. So it's fascinating how many organisations need to work together to make sport, physical activity and movement happen. It's really rarely contained neatly within one organisation. And especially when you think of inclusivity, can have the best leisure centre in the world, but if part of a town can't get there because the bus service has been cancelled, they're not going to go. So we've really needed to think about the way that organisations, especially locally, can make movement happen for their communities. And then places. So actually, the more we understand about sport and physical activity, the more we know that the places and spaces where we live our lives and the way they're designed, so our houses, our streets, our workplaces, parks, public spaces, the way that they are actually designed and planned can really radically affect the way that people move around them. So we know that that needs to change, and policies. So integration of health, transport, physical activity, all of the education, all of those big kind of policy, strategy, budgeting decisions nationally and locally that could be way better aligned and use the evidence that is available in a much more powerful way. So we know that needs to change for the long-term outcome, but that is still so much bigger than Sport England can directly achieve alone. So we said, well, what happens before that? And we rode back again to our short-term outcomes. And we said, well, the only reasonable impact that we can have on collaborative effort of that scale is to set clear ambitions with a large number of organisations and essentially unlock their potential. So we have a really wide partnership network, but this has caused us to think a bit differently about our role with that partnership network and who's in it. So we think this is kind of really sharpened our minds, because it's really helped us think about our greatest value to the people that we work with, as well as the end vision. So this kind of helping develop leadership capacities for inclusion and collaboration, agreements around what to focus collaborative efforts on that mean things to everyone, kind of shared purpose, governance and integrity. So when people are collaborating, when you cross organisational boundaries, when you're working with vulnerable communities, governance, safeguard, integrity becomes so essential, and that's things we can practically work on. And purposeful collaboration. So what are the spaces, the platforms, the topics that we organise around, as well as this kind of creation of new, innovative, inclusive opportunities. So these are things we can directly impact. We can directly work on these things with thousands of organisations. And so we need to operationally organise ourselves to do that. So we're realigning around the sorts of services that can help us do that. And actually what we spotted here as well is an essential feedback loop. It feels kind of obvious, but I think it really landed something for us that I want to pass on, because it's one of those light bulb moments. We are always evaluating our work, and we're always trying to gather evidence of the impact of sport and physical activity, but we saw this loop a lot more strongly. The stronger the evidence is about how movement affects the things everyone cares about in life, the more confidence there is for the government and actually other people to invest. And the stronger our decision-making capability becomes as an organisation. So we get better and better at doing our work. So that feels like the obvious loop, but it made us realise that doing the right thing, if you know what I mean, the vision is the same thing as our organisational sustainability and the sustainability of the system we support. So unless we can gather this evidence, we can't sustain ourselves in the system. And unless we achieve the impact, we can't gather the evidence. So I hope that makes sense if I say that I think probably in most instances, it's not just doing good, it's doing what's needed for the sustainability of the service or the organisation or the system. So this is clearly done at a cross-organisational level in an ecosystem. I think it's therefore fair to say that it's possibly the most complex attempt that you sort of scale that you can attempt. But actually quite a few of our teams have now started to do this at the layers beneath. So for example, at a service level or a product level, and they're finding that really useful and effective as a tool. So that backwards logic has got this emergent forwards logic, and again, these things interact. Sport England organising itself to partner and invest, it creates the conditions, it enables other organisations to take action, it changes the conditions for people to live more active lives, which improves lives. So this is kind of the very top level. You won't be surprised to know that in each of these buckets there's all the richness we originally kind of conceived of, but that's kind of where we've got to now.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Naomi. And yeah, so much of that resonates. And I think the feedback loop in particular, I think, is something that comes up a lot around, well, are we doing a theory of change here for, like you mentioned, the good in the world? Well, actually, no, the sustainability of our organisations is absolutely integral to whether we're able to have that impact. And so holding the kind of financial sustainability of what we're doing and the profits that we need to make, or the way that we need to grow, the reputation that we need to hold, that's all part and parcel of being able to have a positive social and environmental impact. And it's okay for those things to all live in sync within this methodology, I think. And the other thing that you were saying, I think that was super interesting, was that kind of the pragmatism that we need to bring into this methodology to make it live, to make it something that we continue to evolve. And I think that kind of survival theory meets the theory of change is such a brilliant way to kind of highlight that need. And then I think the other thing that I noticed when we were working together was that there were a bunch of kind of related benefits of doing this process. So I think just by the sheer benefit of having these dialogues with all these different teams and getting that shared alignment, you begin to unearth some possibly duplication in the work that we're doing, silos, gaps, opportunities. So there are a lot of kind of related benefits to opening up these dialogues that go beyond just producing the impact mapping off the back of it. So moving on, the other question I wanted to ask Naomi was, what triggered the impact mapping process for you? What was the first sort of spark?
As well as everything already on the slide, I think the language I would want to use is it was a real growing sense of what we've started to call the missing middle. So this leap between the work we do, the services we design, and this sort of end outcome was feeling like this gulf and becoming very, very practically difficult operationally. So examples are when we're in the design steps of services, programs and work, trying to design around very, very large, long-term societal shifts without knowing what the thing you're shooting for in between is, with clarity and with kind of, if you will, sort of formalized in the organization, was making those planning processes really difficult and also, I'd say, quite repetitive. So almost every time anyone designed anything, they had to wrestle with the whole and kind of have a unique process of trying to work out what the most important outcomes were for that piece of the puzzle. So we were really feeling that. We were also feeling that measuring our performance and the impact of our work was challenging when kind of by definition these things are long term and large, and so they don't change overnight. So we needed to understand how to keep our confidence and to see whether some of the things we expect to change on that journey are changing and whether we think we're going in the right direction. So this kind of missing middle was becoming really problematic for us, and this is what triggered us into this work.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, because I think organizations often fall into two camps. Either they've got very long-term ambitions, or they're struggling to see beyond the really short term. And yeah, like you say, that kind of the murky space in the middle is the bit that often is the one that needs the most attention, and to unearth some of those differences in view. And I think just some of the other things that might trigger it in other organizations would be that maybe possibly disagreements in direction or priorities. We've mentioned the gaps in logic, where we're finding that possibly social and environmental impact are missing from our conversations. I think that's happening less and less now, but certainly has been a factor. And then also that kind of lack of clarity on what to measure, or maybe more accurately, it's sort of the lack of clarity on finding measures beyond organizational performance, or measures that are meaningful to our organization but not to our wider community and society and the environment. So we've talked about the mapping process, but we also wanted to spend a bit of time just situating that in what is essentially a sort of a three-part process, which is scanning for impact, mapping the impact, and measuring the impact. And those three things make up a bit of a framework for setting our intent and also measuring the extent of the impact of our work. And these are steps that you can follow at any stage really within your strategic cycle or your service or product development cycle. But in an ideal scenario, I guess you'd be doing the scanning exercises when you're trying to identify the problem. So often that will be at discovery stage. And I think within the UCD field, within that discovery phase, we often fixate on user problems. And I think what scanning does is encourage us to widen that net just slightly wider, so that we're making sure that we're doing activities that help us consider the wider societal and environmental problems that are related to our product or service area. But in reality, you can do these exercises whether you're at service inception, or whether you're an early stage product or service, or if your service has been live for many years. And the further along you are in that journey, the more data you'll have to draw on, the richer your understanding, and that's all super valuable. So essentially, this acts as a bit of a framework to help you step back from the day-to-day and just be able to stretch into the longer term view whenever it is that you need that. So it can really be useful at any point. And so just digging into these in a little bit more detail. So when it comes to scanning, that's really about understanding our context, understanding our users, understanding others who are affected by what we do, identifying problems out there, and also exploring risks and harms. And then using that understanding to map and align around the impact and outcomes that we aim to achieve within our teams or our programs or our organizations, identifying those gaps and those assumptions that we want to test. And then finally, setting up to measure the things that are going to tell us whether we're achieving those outcomes that we set out to achieve. So this is an overview of some of the activities that you might be carrying out within each of those stages. And I think one of the benefits that we've been kind of alluding to of impact mapping is its versatility. So you can do this in a really light touch way or go really in depth, both depending on how much time or effort you're able to give as a team, how ambitious you want to be with your impact goals, but also how complex the space is that you're working in. So this is a bit of a matrix of activities that enable that kind of light touch at the top to the more deeper engagement with the method. And I think the more in-depth that you go, the more rigorous and scientific the approach becomes, the more expertise you're going to need in the team, but also the more you can then rely on the data that you're collecting off the back of it. So taking this in a really light touch way might mean, for example, doing a bit of consequence scanning, which is at the top of the scan column. I think Lauren's going to pop a link in the chat to an exercise online. There are lots of resources online around consequence scanning. It's a really helpful light touch technique to help teams consider the positive and negative consequences of their services. And that can provide really useful inspiration for the sorts of outcomes that you might look to achieve and what risks you might have to mitigate against. And then you might move into a mapping workshop to define your impact and your outcomes and to start thinking about some of the enablers of those outcomes. And then you might run a follow-up session to brainstorm some of the things that might indicate that those outcomes are moving in the way that you hope for them to move, and how you might go about measuring what's working. And all of these sort of stages are underpinned by user research, by secondary research, but also co-designing with the people who have a stake in and are affected by what you deliver. And that's super important, that this is underpinned by understanding our users, understanding the environment that we're operating in. So Naomi, you're going to bring some of that to life, particularly around the scanning side of things.
Yeah, I won't talk for long here. I think there's really only kind of one major bit of learning that feels important to me, which is that we did turn to many of those techniques that you referenced: barrier analysis, audience insight, force field analysis. We looked at strength of evidence, etc. But the main thing I suppose I want to say is that we realised we already had access to a lot of that information and data, and we could turn to it with this slightly through this lens. So an example of that, a good one, is this horizon scanning. So when we were developing our strategy, we conducted a piece of work to look at how the landscape that we're all working and operating in is likely to change during the lifetime of that strategy, because we're thinking, well, we're writing for the future, not for now. So what is it that we're likely to be working within as a landscape? And that was really important for writing the strategy, but we've turned back to that, and we're able to say, well, okay, well, what's the context that we're likely to be in for this long term and medium term? And that helped us really think about outcomes through that lens. And similarly, we've turned to good pieces of kind of analysis that some of our program and service teams have done. So this is just an example of a force field analysis done by one of our teams thinking about community local work. And again, that's meant what in the short term outcome space, what is the important sort of operating context landscape in which this is happening. But we turn to really practical things as well that I think probably almost every organisation has, I want to say, kind of floating around, business cases, audience insight, customer research, evidence scans. And actually that was a real benefit of doing the work with people as well, with colleagues, because they were able to surface things. Yeah, they were kind of stuff that was obvious to them, but we might not have known about or might not have thought to be useful. So yeah, it's worth thinking about what's immediately at your fingertips that can really help with this in the scan. I think we only freshly did a piece of analysis around causal mapping. So just because we know this and we know this, do we know about the strength of the connection? So if this happens, does it drive that? I think everything else was kind of reusing information.
I think that's reassuring, because I'm sure a lot of people will be looking at this thinking, well, that's really in depth. But like you say, so much of this is buried there somewhere, and great to kind of take a pragmatic approach with it. Okay, brilliant. So we're going to move on, conscious of time. We've got a bit more content to get through. So what does prioritising the right thing look like? So there isn't really a hard and fast rule on this, and so much will depend on some of the choices that you're making as a team or as an organisation around what kind of scale of impact that you want to have, how ambitious you want to be with that, the depth of the impact. So you might choose to have a deeper impact amongst a smaller group of people or within a smaller kind of more localized area, rather than spreading more thin. But you'll also want to be making considerations around your audiences and whose needs are greatest, the financial investments that you're able to take, the organizational investment, the timeframes that you're working within, and also the effort and the risk that you're willing to take on. which also links, I think, to the role that you want to play. And it could be that if you're a more established player, you might be able to take on more risk, which might mean that you have the power and influence to act as a catalyst for others to have a greater impact. So you kind of play that catalytic role. Or as a more nimble and agile player, you might be well positioned to experiment and take risks in that way. Or as a more networked player, you might be in a position to tackle more complex areas of the problem. Or if you're in a smaller space, then you might be better off actually breaking down and simplifying the problem space that you're in. Or you might be able to be in a position to take on the less glamorous but the really essential work that you know will fill gaps for other people. There are many more roles, but I think working out your role can really help act as a compass for where you might be best placed to prioritise your work and the impact that you're aiming for. I think there's also a question around evidence, because typically in the nonprofit space, the received wisdom has been to move towards where the evidence is weakest, because that's where the evidence needs to be built and where we need better understanding. But that maybe doesn't apply so much in the wider context, and it will really depend again on your ability to take on risk. So it might be that there are gaps in the market that mean that you're willing and interested in trialing less trodden paths. Or you might be in a better position to actually scale and build on activities and solutions that have been proven to work already or elsewhere. But every team, every service, organisation will always be faced with a number of enablers and a number of constraints. And those are really, really helpful guardrails for narrowing down our focus when it comes to our impact strategy. So using these constraints can really help contain us and focus us. And those are both in terms of external constraints, but also internal constraints, such as the resource that you have available, your infrastructure, both in terms of your technical infrastructure, your physical infrastructure, the spaces that you work in, your social infrastructure, the maturity of your teams, the capabilities and the skills and the tools that you have, but also the power that you hold within your industry. So all of those provide helpful fuel, but also constraint that can create that container to maximize your impact. Naomi, I'm handing to you to talk a bit about prioritization in the context. I realise I've given you about a minute to do this, so apologies for that.
It's fine, it's good timing because we actually are still in this part of the process. So this is the bit that we're really kind of reached now and wrestling with. But I do not want to miss this chance that if everybody takes only one thing from this webinar, I think it's the word ninjal. Lisa's just sent us a message. He sent us a direct message, which I didn't realise, which is ninjal was a great word, ninja, nimble and agile. So we're trying to be ninjal about our prioritisation right now. And but yeah, it's you've seen that map. It's full of indicators and potential changes, and what we've needed to do is bubble to the surface. What are the things that are most evidenced that we feel are the most important drivers of change? How reliable are the measures around that? How frequently will they report? How realistic is it in terms of the methods and the tooling? So we've been going through this kind of, what bubbles to the surface? There's a version of this, which is really the prioritized indicators for us. And then looking at those as a whole, and I guess some balancing factors like just common sense, does this make sense now as a sort of elevated set of indicators? Does it tell a story by itself? Do they reflect what matters to us, what matters to the people who are part of this? We operate in a very political context, so does it make sense in the politics of today? Will it make sense for the politics of the future? So we're really just in that wrestle right now, but those are some of the things we're thinking about.
Amazing. And I think it's really good that you've mentioned common sense, because I think one of the pushbacks or questions that come up a lot around impact mapping is like, am I equipped to do this? Do I have the knowledge? Do I have the skills? And actually it's this sort of this reminder that actually we're all able to use our common sense and our logic to think, does this actually make sense? Can we imagine this playing out in this way? Or is it just jargon? So we all have that ability. I think the more we can kind of reinforce that, the better. So a final word on where to start with all of this, and I am going to do it in a minute. So firstly, it's about deciding what you need. And I think the first step with that is just beginning by establishing at what scale you think you need to be working at. Are you looking at an individual level? Are you talking about improving your memory? Or are you going right down into the ecosystem and working at a much more systemic level? So establishing that can just, again, create some guardrails. And I think once you've got that, then the next thing is working out what's going to serve you and your teams the most. So is this about sense checking and aligning and just setting some direction and having a dialogue? Or is it about defining some more rigorous measures and your approach to data collection? Or are you looking for a kind of a broader, much more encompassing ecosystem approach that supports you to situate not just your work, but the work of others in the context of the systems that you have influence in? Secondly, it's about dedicating the right time and the resource and getting the buy-in that you need. So making sure that you've got that senior support and buy-in, making sure that you have time as a team to actually work collaboratively together, to run these workshops, to create the space to have those dialogues, because that's really the richness of this approach, is all in the debate and the dialogue. Being inclusive is so important to that, and making sure that you're responding to the voices that are in the room, recognizing who isn't in the room and bringing those voices in, because the richness and the quality of your thinking is absolutely dependent on you representing the people who are affected by the products and services that you deliver. Assigning champions, communicating what you're doing, setting those expectations for what this means and how this might impact your work. And then thirdly, getting some help. So bringing in people from outside your specific team or your service area or organization to facilitate those discussions is so useful for acting as a sounding board. Again, kind of creating that space and helping keep people on track when you've got particularly opinionated stakeholders. So having that facilitation and creating that safe space is really important. But also getting help along the way. So as Naomi mentioned, Naomi, you mentioned that you've run 20 plus sessions internally to bring that input. And I think the more you could be getting that feedback and that input, the richer your output. And also the more likely you are that this is going to be visible. It's going to be acting like a living document, and that people feel agency to challenge, to change it as you learn what's working and what isn't. So finally, there isn't a lot, I think, that can go wrong with impact mapping. As I said at the start, it's not really about the methodology, but what you want to get from it. And you might find that other methods are doing this for you just as well. And we really want to hear about that and just build our knowledge as a community around, well, what is helping us connect what we're doing with what we want to achieve. But at its worst, it can create some really healthy dialogue and debate and get people thinking outside their immediate context. But at its best, it can influence the direction of our services, of our organizations, and it can act as a non-binding social contract within our teams to help all of us make decisions that help us live more in line with our values. And I think that's it. Lauren, I'm going to hand over to you.
Oh, brilliant. That was great. Thank you both so much. Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, if you guys do have any questions, please do add them to the chat or the Q&A at the bottom of your screen now. I'm aware we've only got about 5 or 6 minutes left, but we'll try and get through as many as possible. But if we don't get a chance to answer your question, we'll make sure to drop you an email with the response as well. So if you do have one, please do send it across. So I'll jump straight into it. I think the first question we've had is, as a service designer, what should I be doing next?
Brilliant. Thanks, Lauren. And thanks for the question. So that's a really good question, because I think there are those 3 things that we landed on at the start: deciding what we need. Oh my goodness, I've forgotten those 3 steps myself. Deciding what you need and what boundaries, getting the resource and buy-in are I would say, are the first steps. But I think there's another thing which is around connecting what that strategic mapping exercise can mean in our day-to-day context. And one way to do that, actually, a simple way, could be to think about the user journey. We were going to talk about this earlier in the presentation, really didn't have time, but to think about the user journey long tail. So it might be that kind of when you're running your user journey mapping will often end at the point in which the interaction ends with our customers. And I think what we can start doing is thinking about, well, what happens off the back of that? What happens beyond that point of interaction? And you might be able to start layering outcomes and impact into our user journeys, so that we're keeping an eye on what those consequent outcomes might look like. And it's probably likely that our teams are not necessarily always going to have control or influence over those next steps, but that's fine. But even just being aware of what's happening beyond those interactions is useful, because it empowers. Knowledge is power, and it means that it can kind of help maybe influence what kind of design decisions we make next. So I don't know if that's useful. I think it applies to service mapping as well. It's how can we start layering in some of these longer term considerations into our day-to-day exercises.
Just as you're saying that, Nicola, I think you just inspired a thought, which is somebody mentioned in the what does impact mean to you, understanding the effects you're having, positive and negative. And I think at a product level, at a service level, thinking about the likely anticipated impacts of things, and from those kind of dimensions, good, bad, ugly, can be really useful, because it ties into other really important service mentalities like risk. And I think you can really uncover some stuff of this might achieve this, but it might end up with this reputational risk, or it might achieve this, but it might shift our space, or it might change the way that people think about us and our place in the sector or the system. And I think that's just a more rounded view of essentially risk work.
Yeah, that's so true. And actually, we were doing a scenario planning exercise yesterday, and that's a great space that you mentioned to be, broadening out that conversation and thinking about what are those impacts and how can we mitigate against those. It also just made me think about the fact that impact mapping generally is in this sort of optimistic space. You're mapping the positive intent, but really the work that you're doing to get to that point is definitely to consider potential harms and to consider the potential negative impacts, and work with those potential risks to turn them into mitigation strategies, which can in themselves become outcomes, if that makes sense. It's almost like you're accounting for those negatives, and by mapping those within your process, you're keeping an eye on what might happen.
Perfect, thank you. I know we've only got 2 minutes left, but we've got 2 more that I think we can probably get through. First one I think is pretty quick. We've just had a question in the chat asking if we can share the book recommendation that I think you referenced earlier, Nicola. I'm not sure if you know kind of the title off the top of your head, but if we don't, we can always kind of send it out after in the follow-up email, so that's fine. But the next one that we've got is, how do you keep this as a living piece of work that facilitates ongoing conversations? Are there tools or platforms you recommend to do this?
Great question. It's a great question. Nicola, I don't know what you think. For me, this is the hardest part of the process. The sort of getting to the map is one thing, and then the map meaning something and having a life and being essentially part of the actual feedback loop. If it gets stronger, it gets richer, we build it. It feels, well, the tools processes, the one we're using is Miro. I'm not on commission, but it means everybody can access it. It's live, it's editable. It stops it being like, we've put it on, even though it's on a PowerPoint today, we've put it on a PowerPoint as an artifact, and that almost creates this artificial slides. So on a platform that's living is helpful and constantly editable. But also we've kind of reached the moment where we think we have to design this into business as usual. So what are the reporting cycles? What's the reflection cycle? How does this keep coming back up to be revised and reviewed? Feels like it's an important process to be designed into, a kind of business as usual reporting loops. But that's super challenging. We're finding that hard right now.
Yeah, I agree, Naomi. And I think the other thing is, it's a really useful thing that you can return back to at the beginning and end of your discoveries and your alphas, and before you're shifting. It's in those moments where you're making key organizational or service decisions where you want to be bringing this back into the conversation, and using it, when you're transitioning from discovery into alpha, or when you're transitioning from alpha into beta. And I think a key part of that is, as Naomi said, keeping it as a living document in spaces that are accessible. But also, I think fundamentally it's who's been involved in designing it in the first place. No one tends to refer back to an impact map that they've not had a stake in the beginning. So it's just being aware of if you want this to live, just make sure that you're involving those people as early as possible so that they have agency and they have a sense of ownership over it as early as possible.
Stay ninja, people.
Can we end on that note?
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, I just wanted to say sort of thank you guys so much for today's session. It's been so great to hear more about impact mapping and how you've done it at Sport England, and just to get all of your insights. As I mentioned earlier, we've recently published a white paper with our findings from our study into prioritisation, which is kind of where this all these webinars came from. So I'll just send a link in the chat to you guys now. And I think, Nicola, if you could just go on to the next slide, there's also a QR code that people should be able to access. Thank you. Yeah, and then also just kind of a huge thank you to everyone for coming along. We'd love to hear your feedback, so please do send it across, and we'd love to see you at our session next week. So yeah, thank you very much. I hope you all have a lovely afternoon, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.